World War II stretched from the Pacific shores to the plains of Europe, with thousands of battles large and small. No single clash could decide it all. Yet some battles marked irreversible turning points in the course of the war. At Stalingrad, Germany suffered its first strategic defeat and lost the myth of invincibility. At Normandy, the Western Allies opened the road into the heart of Europe. And at Kursk, two giant war machines collided in the largest tank battle in history, where the Red Army seized the initiative and ended Hitler's dream of a counteroffensive once and for all. 3 battles, 3 turning points, 3 reminders that war is written in blood, sacrifice, and history's crossroads. What follows is the journey through 3 battles that reshaped the course of the greatest war of the 20th century. In the winter of 1941, Nazi Germany's blitzkrieg against Moscow was halted and pushed back. After that defeat, by mid-1942, Adolf Hitler realized that the Soviet Union could not be subdued quickly through a lightning war. The conflict had entered a war of attrition, and to win, Germany had to focus on the enemy's vital resources. Hitler chose the southern front of the Soviet Union, home to vast wheat fields, coal mines, and above all, the rich oil fields of the Caucasus. The strategic goal of the 1942 summer offensive, codenamed Fall Blau, Case Blue, was to seize the oil fields of Maikop, Grozny, and Baku, while cutting off the transport route along the Volga River, the lifeline connecting the southern and northern Soviet territories. In this context, Stalingrad, now Volgograd, a major industrial city on the Volga, became a critical target. It was a strategic transportation hub, the gateway for moving oil from the Caucasus to the north. Capturing Stalingrad would not only allow the Germans to control this vital route, but also secure the northern flank of their advance into the Caucasus. But the city also held symbolic importance. It bore the name of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. For Hitler, taking Stalingrad would strike a heavy blow to Soviet morale. For the USSR, defending it was a matter of national honor. In the summer of 1942, Hitler mobilized Army Group South, comprising dozens of divisions, to strike toward both the Caucasus and Stalingrad. Under the plan, Army Group A would move into the Caucasus, while Army Group B, including the German 6th Army under Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, the 4th Panzer Army, and allied Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian units, would capture Stalingrad and hold the Volga front. On June 28, 1942, Operation Blau began. German forces swept across the southern steppe, winning a string of victories thanks to their mobility and the power of the Luftwaffe. By July, they had crossed the Don River, seized Voronezh, July 7th, and forced the Soviets to abandon Rostov by the month's end. Deep armored thrusts tore massive gaps in the Red Army's defenses, forcing the Soviets to commit their last reserves to seal the breaches. On July 28th, in this dire situation, Stalin issued Order Number 227. Not one step back, enforcing iron discipline to prevent any retreat. Every available fighter, from regular troops to civilian militias, was sent to defend Stalingrad. Defensive lines were established at the city's gateway, near a bend of the Don River. The 62nd and 64th Armies held the west bank, backs to the river, determined not to let the enemy cross. With no path of retreat, they had no choice but to hold their ground to the last. On August 23, 1942, the spearhead of Germany's 6th Army reached the outskirts of Stalingrad with the shimmering Volga River visible ahead. That same day, the Luftwaffe unleashed an unprecedented air raid. Over 1,000 tons of bombs were dropped within 24 hours. burning much of the city and turning it into a sea of fire. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed, and the entire city shook under the onslaught. In the following days, relentless carpet bombing flattened large sections of the city, leaving behind a dead city buried under rubble. Yet the ruins became a natural fortress for the Soviet defenders. When German units pushed into the city's edges, they quickly realized Stalingrad would not fall easily. Under the command of General Vasily Chuikov, the Soviet 62nd Army clung to every street and every pile of bricks, ready to trade blood for every meter of ground. The northern and southern suburbs soon fell to the Germans, splitting the Soviet defenders in two. At points where the Germans reached the west bank of the Volga, the Soviets risked crossing the river at night to send reinforcements, one battalion at a time, holding fragile bridgeheads. Among these reinforcements was the 13th Guards Rifle Regiment under Colonel Alexander Rodimtsev, whose men, upon landing, immediately counterattacked to retake key high ground. From that point, the battle became an unprecedented street-fighting nightmare. Both sides fought over individual houses, walls, and even floors. By day, German artillery and aircraft hammered Soviet positions. By night, the Red Army launched surprise counterattacks. Landmarks such as Mamayev Kurgan Hill, Railway Station No. 1, Pavlov's House, and the Tractor, Barricade, and Red October factories changed hands repeatedly. German soldiers called it the Rat War, room by room, cellar to cellar fighting, where the enemy could appear without warning from behind a collapsed wall or on a rooftop. Tanks and heavy artillery were almost useless in the shattered cityscape, and casualties mounted at every street corner. As the Soviet lines were pushed into narrow strips along the river, Field Marshal Paulus ordered a massive assault on the northern industrial sector. German infantry and armor stormed the tractor plant and Barricade factory, engaging in brutal close-quarters combat. Soviet paratroopers made suicidal charges to stop the tanks, while Katyusha rocket batteries from the east bank poured fire in support. The Germans seized part of the factories, pushing Soviet forces back to the water's edge. Some Soviet units, trapped in narrow riverbank pockets only tens of meters from the Volga, held out for days under constant attack. By mid-November 1942, the Germans controlled about 90% of Stalingrad. Only a thin strip along the river remained in Soviet hands, stubborn strongpoints waiting for the right moment to strike back. Paulus did not realize that the long flanks of his 6th Army were held only by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian units, forces badly weakened and poorly equipped. The Soviet High Command saw this as the enemy's fatal weakness and was secretly concentrating massive forces for a decisive counterstroke, Operation Uranus. At dawn on November 19th, 1942, as a pale sun began to break over the frozen steppe, the sky suddenly shook with the roar of over 3,500 Soviet artillery pieces and mortars. Salvo after salvo thundered into the positions of Romanian troops holding the northern flank of Stalingrad. Mixed in with the crash of heavy guns was the distinctive shriek of hundreds of Katyusha rocket launchers, unleashing blinding volleys of fire that rained down on the enemy. This was the opening blow of Operation Uranus, a massive combined arms double envelopment. On the northern axis, the southwestern front under General Nikolai Vatutin committed 3 full armies, spearheaded by over 1,000 T-34s, KV-1s, and self-propelled guns supported by mechanized infantry. The early morning mist was torn apart by the roar of engines and the grinding of steel tracks over the ice. The defensive lines of Romania's 3rd Army, lacking effective anti-tank weapons, crumbled almost instantly. Within hours, the Soviet spearheads had driven 25 to 30 kilometers deep, leaving behind burned-out tanks, shattered artillery, and dead littering the trenches. On the morning of November 20th, On Stalingrad's southern flank, the Stalingrad front under General Alexander Yeremenko launched a similar assault against Romania's Fourth Army along the Don River. The attack opened with a storm of fire from thousands of guns and katyushas, turning defensive positions into a sea of smoke. As the barrage lifted, waves of T-34s and infantry surged forward, smashing through the already faltering defenses. Romanian infantry, armed mostly with rifles and light machine guns, had no chance of stopping the armored tide. From both north and south, the Soviet armored spearheads bypassed isolated pockets of resistance, accelerating across snow-covered fields. Tank columns thundered westward, overrunning supply convoys and severing communications, driving straight into the German rear. On November 23, 1942, at the town of Kalach, the two Soviet pincers met. Cheers and gunfire erupted as soldiers from both fronts shook hands amid the freezing wind and drifting smoke. The massive encirclement had closed, trapping all German and Allied forces in the Stalingrad pocket. Around 330,000 troops, the entirety of the German Sixth Army, part of the Fourth Panzer Army, and Romanian and Italian units, were now sealed inside a 100-kilometer-wide Kessel. The shock was immediate. German field commanders urged General Friedrich Paulus to break out, while the Soviets were still consolidating their outer ring. In reality, the last days of November were the best, and perhaps only, chance for escape. But from his headquarters in Obersalzberg, Adolf Hitler forbade any withdrawal, ordering Paulus to hold Stalingrad at all costs, as he had previously done at Leningrad and Moscow. That blind confidence was bolstered by Field Marshal Hermann Göring's promise that the Luftwaffe could sustain the encircled army with an air bridge, as it had, to a far lesser extent, at Demyansk earlier in 1942. In reality, the task was impossible. Nearly 500 tons of supplies were needed daily to sustain almost 300,000 men. But even under the best conditions, the Luftwaffe delivered barely 100 tons, less than 1/5 of the requirement. By December, worsening weather and deadly Soviet anti-aircraft fire were shooting down Ju-52 transports in large numbers, and many supply drops fell straight into Soviet hands. Inside the Kessel, German troops were slowly starved. Ammunition and medicine dwindled. Rations dropped to a few hundred grams of stale bread a day. Paulus tightened his defensive lines into the ruined urban terrain, forming a perimeter of about 60 kilometers. According to Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, some 290,000 German and Allied troops, along with more than 10,000 Soviet civilians unable to evacuate, were trapped inside. Beyond the pocket, General Konstantin Rokossovsky of the Don Front established two rings, an inner cordon to strangle the trapped forces and an outer cordon to repel any relief attempts. Soon after, German High Command entrusted Field Marshal Manstein, newly appointed to lead the Don Army Group, with launching a counteroffensive, the last faint hope of rescuing Paulus. By mid-December 1942, despite the risk of Soviet offensives erupting across the entire front, Adolf Hitler committed the last of his reserves to save the encircled army at Stalingrad. The plan, codenamed Operation Wintergewitter, Winter Storm, placed overall command in the hands of Field Marshal Erich von Manstein. The main strike force was the 57th Panzer Corps of the 4th Panzer Army, led by General Hermann Hoth, tasked with attacking from the southwest, breaking through the Soviet ring, and driving straight into Stalingrad. Manstein assembled 3 elite panzer and mechanized divisions, supported by several infantry and paratrooper divisions withdrawn from the Caucasus. On December 12, 1942, Hoth's spearhead rolled out from Kotelnikovo, about 160 kilometers southwest of Stalingrad. In the opening days, Hoth's attack achieved surprise. The armored spearhead smashed aside Soviet forward units and advanced rapidly across the snow-covered steppe. After a week of fighting, the 57th Panzer Corps had crossed the Aksai River and reached the approaches to the Mishkova River, now only 50 kilometers from General Friedrich Paulus and the trapped 6th Army. Inside the Stalingrad Kessel, Paulus and his senior officers watched this final glimmer of hope draw closer. They proposed launching a breakout to meet Hoth's advance, but Hitler refused. On December 18, 1942, with Hoth just 40 kilometers from the city, Manstein urgently appealed to Hitler to authorize Paulus to attack outward and link up. Hitler's answer was an uncompromising, hold your ground order. The 6th Army was to remain in place and fight to the last man. Fate struck a cruel blow. Just as the Germans were pouring strength into the relief effort, on December 16, 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Little Saturn, striking the Italian 8th Army along the Don River west of Stalingrad. In less than 2 weeks, the Italian 8th Army was annihilated, creating a gaping hole in the rear of Manstein's relief force. Facing the risk of a Soviet breakthrough and the severing of his own lines of retreat, Manstein halted Operation Wintergewitter. He immediately diverted the 6th Panzer Division at his last reserve to counter the new threat on the western flank. Without reinforcements, Hoth's spearhead froze in place, unable to advance further. Under mounting Soviet counterattacks, German forces pulled back from the Mishkova River by the end of December, ending all hope of rescuing the 6th Army. Operation Winter Storm had failed, leaving over 40,000 German dead on the battlefield, along with nearly all the tanks and artillery committed to the operation. For the 6th Army trapped in Stalingrad, Manstein's withdrawal was nothing short of a death sentence. From late December 1942, even the tenuous air supply dwindled and then stopped altogether. The Soviets systematically seized the improvised airfields used by the Luftwaffe. On January 16, 1943, the Potomnik airfield fell. On January 23rd, Gumrak, the last functioning airstrip inside the pocket, was captured. From then on, the Germans had no supply or evacuation route other than a few desperate airdrops. Inside the city, tens of thousands of troops sank into exhaustion. Hunger, cold, and disease ravaged them in the brutal -30 degrees Celsius winter. Deaths from starvation and freezing soon outnumbered those from combat. Nearly 300,000 German soldiers wandered among the rubble searching for shelter, alongside 20,000 wounded groaning in damp cellars without medicine. Food and ammunition were gone. Morale collapsed. Field Marshal Paulus later admitted that his men had slipped rapidly into a state of total exhaustion, both physically and mentally, in the final weeks at Stalingrad. Realizing that the German forces inside the Kessel were exhausted, the Soviet High Command decided to launch the final operation to wipe out the 6th Army. Codenamed Koltso, the Ring, the assault began on the morning of January 10, 1943, after Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus rejected an ultimatum to surrender issued on January 8th. More than 7,000 Soviet guns opened fire in a massive barrage, clearing the way for infantry and tanks to advance. Waves of artillery rained down on German positions. Then T-34s roared forward, crushing defensive strongpoints street by street. Though near collapse, German units resisted fiercely in some areas, but the Red Army adjusted tactics. Strongholds were bypassed and isolated, while the main thrust shifted rapidly to other targets. Within days, German forces were split into smaller pockets and pushed deeper into the city's ruins. By January 17, 1943, after a week of fighting, the Soviets paused to regroup and realign their attack. At this stage, the area under German control had shrunk to less than a quarter of its original size. From far away, Hitler still sent orders to hold to the last man, but such commands over the radio could not change the brutal reality on the ground. On January 22nd, the Soviets resumed their all-out assault. 4 days later, on January 26th, Soviet assault groups linked up in the city center, cutting the 6th Army into 2 isolated pockets. The northern sector, under General Karl Strecker, held out in the shattered tractor factory complex. The southern sector, including Paulus's headquarters, entrenched itself in the city center. The final battles raged beneath collapsed buildings, with Soviet troops fighting room to room and calling for the Germans to surrender through loudspeakers. Knowing the situation was hopeless, Paulus requested Hitler's permission to capitulate and save the remaining lives. Instead, on January 30th, 1943, Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, a gesture laden with the expectation that he commit suicide, as no German field marshal had ever surrendered. Hitler ordered Paulus to fight to the last breath or take his own life, never to fall into the hands of the Bolsheviks. But Paulus, a devout Catholic, refused to kill himself for hollow glory, declaring, "I have no intention of wasting my life for such an empty honor." On the morning of January 31st, 1943, in the cold basement of the ruined Univermag department store in central Stalingrad, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus and his staff stepped forward to surrender to the Red Army. Paulus thus became the first field marshal in Nazi Germany's history to be captured alive, defying Hitler's orders to save the men who still remain. The southern German pocket collapsed almost immediately after this. On February 2nd, 1943, General Strecker and the remnants of the northern pocket also laid down their arms. The last gunshots fell silent over the ashes of Stalingrad. The bloodiest battle in human history had ended after 163 days, with about 91,000 German and Axis troops taken prisoner by the Soviets, including 24 generals. The defeated soldiers, starving, freezing, and many gravely wounded, were ordered to march out of the city's ruins. Heads bowed, they trudged toward Soviet POW camps, beginning long years of harsh captivity in the frozen wastes of Siberia. At his headquarters, upon hearing of Paulus's surrender, Hitler flew into a rage. He shouted to his staff, "How can a man like him surrender to the Bolsheviks after seeing 50 to 60,000 of his own men fight to the death?" To Hitler, the loss at Stalingrad was a reversed Thermopylae. He had hoped the 6th Army would fight to the death like the legendary 300 Spartans, but it was not to be. The Battle of Stalingrad ended with a resounding Soviet victory and the most devastating defeat suffered by Nazi Germany since the outbreak of World War II. The 6th Army, once praised by Hitler as the strongest formation in the Wehrmacht, was completely annihilated. Of the roughly 300,000 German and Axis troops trapped in the encirclement, more than 100,000 were killed on the battlefield, and 91,000, including 24 generals, were taken prisoner. In reality, the vast majority of these POWs never returned home. Only about 5,000 to 6,000 survived to be repatriated to Germany after the war, a survival rate of less than 6%. For the Soviet Union, the cost of victory was staggering. Over 1 million Red Army soldiers were killed or wounded in the defense of the city, alongside tens of thousands of civilian deaths. Stalingrad itself was reduced to rubble, a city almost completely leveled, with nothing left but charred walls and shattered foundations. Yet this victory became an immense source of morale for both the Red Army and the Soviet people. It marked the moment when Soviet forces shifted from a defensive posture to an all-out offensive, launching a series of relentless counteroffensives across the entire Eastern Front. In strategic terms, Stalingrad was a decisive turning point. The defeat stripped Hitler's forces of all initiative in the East. From a position of expansion, the Wehrmacht was forced into a defensive stance, continually absorbing the impact of ever larger Soviet offensives in the years that followed. The Soviet triumph at Stalingrad, combined with the Allied victory in North Africa, Tunisia, May 1943, ended the Axis threat of global domination and triggered a major shift in the course of the war. From this point onward, strategic momentum passed entirely to the Allies. 2.5 years later, in May 1945, Nazi Germany was forced to sign an unconditional surrender, closing the darkest chapter in human history. And amid the ruins of Stalingrad, the story of resilience and sacrifice endured, an eternal symbol of the will to fight to the end for freedom and independence. After Stalingrad, the war in Europe would never be the same. The Red Army pushed relentlessly westward, driving the Wehrmacht back step by step. Yet to truly end the war, something more was needed. A second front, one that would strike into Germany from across the sea. For 2 years, Stalin pressed his allies to open that front. And when the moment finally came, the largest amphibious invasion in modern history was set into motion. On June 6, 1944, the world watched as thousands of ships, aircraft, and soldiers crossed the English Channel. Normandy became the gateway for the Allies to enter Europe. By 1944, World War II had reached a decisive turning point. Most of continental Europe lay under the iron grip of Nazi Germany, and all roads to victory pointed toward Berlin. But the Allied forces understood that to truly defeat Hitler, they needed to open a second front in Western Europe, a direct blow from the West to relieve pressure on the Soviets advancing from the East. Thus was born the most ambitious amphibious operation in human history, Operation Overlord. The objective was clear: to send hundreds of thousands of troops across the English Channel, land them on the shores of France, and establish a firm beachhead to push into the heart of the continent. After months of intense planning and reconnaissance, the Allied commanders chose Normandy over the more obvious and narrow Pas de Calais, not because it was closer, but because it was less fortified. Normandy offered long, flat beaches ideal for landing craft. It was within range of Allied air support from Britain. Most importantly, it was thinly defended, thanks to one of the most successful deception operations in history, Operation Bodyguard. The ruse convinced Hitler that the real invasion would take place at Calais, forcing him to withhold reinforcements from the actual landing site. Meanwhile, the Germans had spent years constructing the so-called Atlantic Wall, a massive coastal defense system made of bunkers, gun emplacements, minefields, barbed wire, and underwater obstacles, all designed to repel any seaborne assault. But now, that wall was about to face the ultimate test. At dawn on June 5, 1944, after a one-day delay due to rough weather, Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower gave the final go-ahead for Operation Overlord. More than 5,000 warships, transport vessels, and landing craft departed from southern ports in England, setting course across the Channel in the darkness. Overhead, more than 800 transport planes and thousands of fighters, bombers, and gliders soared toward Normandy, carrying not only the hope of a liberated Europe, but also the steel resolve of hundreds of thousands of soldiers stepping into the battle of an entire generation. The mission was to secure a beachhead nearly 80 kilometers wide along the Normandy coast, divided into 5 sectors: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. American forces would land at Utah and Omaha in the west. British and Canadian troops would hit Gold, Juno, and Sword in the east. The vital tasks on D-Day: capture temporary ports, seize key towns, especially the city of Caen in the east, and connect all landing sectors before German reinforcements could mount a counterattack. This wasn't just a military operation, it was a fight for the future of Europe. A fight between the hope of liberation and the brutal machinery of fascist war entrenched just beyond the waves. In the still darkness just after midnight on June 6, 1944, the first Allied troops set foot on French soil, not from the sea, but from the sky. At exactly 12:15 a.m., Pathfinder teams from the U.S. 101st Airborne Division parachuted behind Utah Beach to mark the drop zones for thousands of paratroopers that would follow. 1 minute later, on the left flank of the invasion front, 3 Silent Horsa gliders from Britain's 6th Airborne Division landed near 2 strategic bridges spanning the Orne River and the Caen Canal. In a bold and nearly flawless assault, 181 British airborne troops under Major John Howard stormed the main bridge at Bénouville, seizing it within minutes and stunning the German sentries. That bridge would later be renamed Pegasus in honor of the British airborne emblem. The second bridge at Ranville was also quickly captured. These 2 bridges were crucial to the eastern flank of the invasion, ensuring the Germans couldn't move armored divisions from Caen to counterattack the beach landings. By 12:50 a.m., more British paratroopers from the 6th Airborne were dropping across the Orne, reinforcing their hold. Meanwhile, on the western flank, the first elements of the U.S. 80th Airborne Division were parachuting near Sainte-Mère-Église, a small town that sat astride the main German reinforcement route toward Utah Beach. Between 1 a.m. and 2 a.m., the skies over Normandy thundered with the sound of endless C-47s releasing more than 13,000 American paratroopers into the darkness. Even with extensive training, the moment the jump doors opened overwhelmed many soldiers. Below them was a black void pierced by anti-aircraft tracers and flashes from bombed-out German positions. Strong winds, low visibility, and enemy fire caused many planes to release troops off target. Hundreds of paratroopers were scattered across swamps, forests, and villages. Some landed in marshes, dragged down by heavy gear and waterlogged parachutes. Many drowned before they could cut themselves free. Others got caught in trees, rooftops, or dropped directly into German-held territory. One trooper from the 82nd Airborne found himself hanging from the church steeple in Sainte-Mère-Église, silently suspended above as firefights raged in the streets below. Throughout the German rear, small Allied groups scrambled to regroup. They navigated the unfamiliar terrain, located rally points, and launched hit-and-run raids against enemy strongholds. Sporadic gunfire echoed through the countryside as patrols from both sides stumbled into each other in the chaos of the night. Despite the misdrops and confusion, the courage and adaptability of the Allied paratroopers allowed them to accomplish key objectives. On the eastern flank, British forces established strongholds around Pegasus Bridge and repelled initial German counterattacks. To the west, units of the 82nd Airborne, led by Major General James Gavin, captured the vital Lafayette Bridge over the Murderette River, though they would hold it under siege for days amid intense German assaults. By 4 a.m., the 3rd Battalion of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment had liberated Sainte-Mère-Église, believed to be the first French town freed on D-Day. Further east, elements of the 101st Airborne had secured key crossroads and small bridges near Utah Beach, clearing the way for reinforcements arriving from the sea. By first light, more than 18,000 Allied paratroopers from the US, UK, and Canada were on French soil. They controlled most of their high-priority targets on both flanks of the beachhead. The eastern flank was secured at Pegasus Bridge, and the western approaches were open. Despite heavy losses, the airborne troops had achieved their mission: to pave the way for the main invasion force in what would become the largest amphibious assault in history. After the airborne forces completed their opening phase under cover of darkness, the battle moved into its decisive stage. As dawn began to break over the English Channel, an unprecedented sight unfolded off the coast of Normandy. An enormous Allied armada stretched across the horizon, anchoring just a few dozen nautical miles from shore in preparation for the main assault. More than 5,000 ships of various types, including battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transports, and landing craft, were organized into task forces, each assigned to one of the 5 landing sectors: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. Between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m., the warships took up formation and began lowering thousands of landing craft into the choppy waters. From the decks of transport ships, tens of thousands of infantrymen descended rope ladders into rocking LCVPs. Many turned pale from seasickness, vomited, or trembled from cold and anticipation. For these men, it was a one-way journey, and they all knew it. As the sky lightened, the first waves of preparatory bombardment began. At exactly 5:30 a.m., the order to open fire was given. A thunderous chorus erupted as Allied warships, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers simultaneously unleashed their naval guns on German fortifications lining the beaches of Normandy. From offshore, massive shells screamed through the sky and crashed into bunkers, pillboxes, artillery emplacements, and machine gun nests. Plumes of smoke and flame erupted across the coastline, some reaching tens of meters high. Overhead, waves of Allied bombers approached from England, dropping payloads on inland German defenses and beach targets. However, many bomber pilots, fearing they might hit friendly troops approaching the shoreline, dropped their bombs farther inland, leaving some coastal defenses largely intact, particularly at Omaha Beach. On the German side, though high alert had been issued, many units failed to respond in time. Some officers still believed this was a diversionary attack. Nonetheless, coastal batteries soon began returning fire. At Longue-sur-Mer, a fortified position between Omaha and Gold beaches, 4 155mm guns opened fire at 5:37 a.m., nearly striking several Allied vessels before being suppressed by British naval fire. While artillery duels raged, the first assault units began approaching the beaches. On the far eastern flank, the British 4th Commando Brigade, accompanied by Free French units, made their way toward the Orne River estuary. They would be the first to storm Sword Beach. At 5:30 a.m., these vanguard troops climbed aboard their landing craft, gripping their rifles tightly, and began the final 7-kilometer run from the motherships to the shoreline. At the same time, a critical mishap occurred off the coast of Omaha. Due to rough seas and limited visibility, several LCTs released their amphibious Sherman DD tanks too far from shore. The result was disastrous. Most of the 32 tanks from the 741st Tank Battalion were swallowed by the waves before they could reach land. Only a few made it onto the beach, leaving the American infantry at Omaha to begin their assault with little to no armored support, just as they were about to face one of the most heavily defended beaches of the entire invasion. 6:30 a.m. H hour. The moment circled on every map, etched into every order. At exactly 6:30 in the morning, the first assault waves of Allied troops hit the shores of Normandy, launching the largest amphibious invasion in history. At Utah Beach, the westernmost sector, the U.S. 4th Infantry Division landed with relatively little resistance. Although strong winds and currents had pushed the landing craft almost 2 kilometers off course, what seemed like a mistake became a stroke of fortune. The new landing zone had virtually no fortified German resistance. Most of the defenders from the German 919th Regiment, 709th Division, were stationed inland, too far to react in time. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the only general to land in the first wave, made a decisive call. "We'll start the war from right here." Without attempting to reorganize, he ordered his troops to advance from the new position. Thanks to that bold move, American forces surged forward, overwhelming scattered German positions and quickly pushing off the beach. Within hours, elements of the 4th Division had linked up with paratroopers from the 101st Airborne waiting at key crossroads inland, establishing a firm bridgehead at Utah. But over at Omaha Beach, Fronting the villages of Vierville-sur-Mer and Colleville, the scene was vastly different. Here, the Americans encountered the most ferocious resistance on the entire front. Despite a 30-minute preparatory naval bombardment, many German bunkers and pillboxes remained intact. The beach was defended by Germany's 352nd Infantry Division, a battle-hardened unit entrenched in interlocking fields of fire from the bluffs above. As soon as the LCVPs lowered their ramps, Omaha erupted into chaos. Mortars rained down from the cliffs, and MG-42 machine guns swept the beach with deadly crossfire. The first wave of American troops had nowhere to hide. Many were cut down before even leaving the boats. Others drowned beneath the weight of their gear. Within minutes, casualties surged into the hundreds. The shoreline was strewn with the dead and wounded, tangled in barbed wire, steel obstacles, and jagged beach defenses. Surviving officers scrambled to regroup, using shell craters and sand mounds as cover to inch forward. The beach echoed with gunfire, shouted orders and cries for help, all blending into a nightmarish soundscape. Later estimates confirmed that around 2,000 Allied troops were killed at Omaha alone, making it the bloodiest landing of D-Day. While Americans fought for survival on their beaches, British and Canadian forces launched their own assaults to the east. At 7 a.m., the British 3rd Infantry Division landed at Sword Beach, stretching from Ouistreham to Lyon-sur-Mer. Defended by the German 736th Regiment, 716th Infantry Division, the beach was lined with strong points hidden among seaside buildings and gun nests at Rivabella. Although German numbers were thin, their resistance was stubborn. With support from specialized tanks like Sherman DDs, AVREs, and rocket-equipped landing craft, the British gradually dismantled the defenses and began pushing inland. At 7:25 a.m., troops from Britain's 50th Division landed at Gold Beach, fronting Arromanches and La Rivière. The terrain here was rugged. Rocky outcrops and high bluffs gave defenders from the German 916th Regiment ideal firing positions. The first British wave drifted slightly east and ran into heavy fire from La Rivière and a devastating 88mm gun hidden on the flank. Using their so-called funny tanks, flamethrowers, mine flails, and bridge layers, the British slowly cleared the strong points. By midday, Gold Beach was largely under control, and British units began pushing toward Bayeux. At 7:45 a.m., the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division arrived at Juno Beach, near Courseulles-sur-Mer. Rough seas sank several amphibious tanks meant to support the assault, forcing Canadian infantry to advance nearly unaided against wire obstacles and concentrated German fire from the 736th and 716th Regiments. Casualties in the first hour were extremely high, higher than Omaha proportionally per unit scale. Still, with grit and reinforcements including Churchill tanks, the Canadians managed to overrun the strong points and advance into the town of Courseulles. Across every beach, D-Day was marked not just by scale, but by raw courage. At Omaha, amidst the chaos, Brigadier General Norman Cota, deputy commander of the U.S. 29th Division, led from the front, shouting, "Rangers, lead the way!" He rallied shattered units and drove them forward. Under his command, soldiers began breaking through minefields and barbed wire, crawling up narrow gullies toward the bluffs. Meanwhile, on Omaha's western flank, at 7:10 a.m., 250 elite U.S. Rangers from the 2nd Ranger Battalion, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder, landed at Point du Hoc, a 100-foot cliff between Omaha and Utah, believed to house German heavy artillery capable of threatening both beaches. Despite heavy surf and gunfire, the Rangers scaled the cliffs using ropes and grappling hooks. At the top, they discovered the artillery had been moved inland. Only decoy logs remained. But they soon located and destroyed the real guns hidden in nearby orchards. The Rangers then held the cliff for 2 full days, repelling relentless German counterattacks until reinforcements arrived. By midday on June 6th, the situation across the Normandy beaches had begun to take shape. At Utah Beach, the U.S. 4th Infantry Division successfully linked up with elements of the 101st Airborne, and together they advanced inland to seize the town of Poupeville, securing it before early afternoon. Behind them, waves of American reinforcements, artillery, engineers, logistics, continued pouring ashore, expanding the beachhead and pushing deeper into the Cottonton Peninsula. At Omaha, after the brutal carnage of the morning, American troops gradually pushed the Germans off key defensive positions. Small, determined assault teams scaled the cliffs, flanked the bunkers, and used grenades and flamethrowers to suppress the defenders from the rear. By early afternoon, the main resistance points along Omaha had been neutralized. From offshore, General Omar Bradley received the long-awaited message. Troops are off the beach and moving up the bluff. It was a hard-won signal, but Omaha had held. On the eastern flank, British forces at Sword Beach pushed nearly 8 kilometers inland, linking up with the 6th Airborne Division at Pegasus Bridge at exactly noon, just as planned. There, exhausted paratroopers who had defended the crossing through the night shook hands with troops arriving from the sea. Leading the relief force was Lord Lovett, commander of the 1st Special Service Brigade, who had marched his men directly from Sword to the bridge. The link-up at Pegasus became a symbolic moment, representing the initial Allied success along the eastern flank. Throughout D-Day, the German command structure remained paralyzed. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, in charge of Army Group B and coastal defenses, was away in Germany on leave. In Paris, Field Marshal von Rundstedt initially believed the landings were a diversion and hesitated to act decisively. It wasn't until the afternoon that the Germans launched their first major counterattack. From the south, the 21st Panzer Division was ordered to strike between Sword and Juno beaches in an effort to split the British and Canadian forces. Around 3 p.m., a column of approximately 50 German tanks emerged near the village of Perriers and advanced rapidly toward the coast. Some tanks even slipped through the gap between the two beaches, reaching the Orne River, where they briefly threatened Allied supply units near the shoreline. However, the bold thrust lacked coordination. Under withering fire from British anti-tank guns and repeated Allied airstrikes, the Panzer column stalled. By late afternoon, surviving tanks withdrew to their original positions. Though the counterattack failed to break the beachhead, it delayed the British advance toward Caen, the primary objective of the 3rd Infantry Division, which remained out of reach by nightfall. Across the entire front, Allied commanders now faced tough decisions, whether to push forward or consolidate gains for the night. On the western flank, General J. Lawton Collins, commanding 7th Corps, was satisfied with Utah's progress, having penetrated 6 to 8 kilometers inland. He ordered his troops to dig in for the night while preparing for the upcoming push toward the port of Cherbourg. In contrast, progress from Omaha remained slow. The bocage country, dense hedgerows and sunken lanes, created natural defensive lines for the Germans. By evening, U.S. forces had only just liberated coastal villages such as Colville and Saint-Laurent, reaching the outskirts of Formigny. British and Canadian troops moved faster across the flatter terrain. Canadian forces at Juno advanced nearly 12 kilometers, making them the deepest Allied penetration on D-Day. They seized Carpiquet airfield near Caen, but halted due to lack of flank support. Meanwhile, British forces from Gold Beach linked up with the Canadians at Juno by dusk, creating a continuous beachhead nearly 20 kilometers wide across the eastern sector. However, a gap still remained between the Americans at Omaha and the British at Gold. Key towns like Bayeux, Carentan, and Saint-Lô, all crucial to linking the fronts, remained under German control. Despite that, the Allies achieved important strategic objectives. At Gold Beach, British forces liberated Arromanches, where they would later install the Mulberry Harbor, a massive artificial port that would become vital for Allied logistics in the weeks to come. At Sword Beach, though Caen remained in German hands, the British had secured coastal villages and anchored their right flank firmly thanks to the reunion with the airborne bridgehead. As night fell over the English Channel, the largest amphibious invasion in human history came to the end of its first day. After hours of brutal combat, the Allied forces had held their ground on French soil. The beaches of Normandy, once engulfed in smoke, chaos, and gunfire, were now scenes of devastation, silence, and exhaustion. Hundreds of scorched landing craft lay wrecked along the shoreline. Burned-out vehicles were scattered across the sand, tangled in barbed wire, iron obstacles, and debris. Next to the fallen, medics and field nurses rushed to treat the wounded. In the dim glow of flashlights, surviving soldiers dug shallow trenches, stacked ammunition and rationed supplies unloaded from ships offshore. Gunfire still crackled sporadically in the distance as isolated German strongpoints were mopped up, but overall the intensity of battle had eased. One thing was clear by dusk: the Allies had secured a foothold on the continent. On the German side, Adolf Hitler finally accepted that this was not a diversion. It was the long-feared invasion of the Western Front. But by then, it was too late. German command had been in disarray all day. Reinforcements were hastily mobilized through the night of June 6th, tasked with defending key towns deeper inland like Carentan, Bayeux, Saint-Lô, and Caen, in hopes of sealing the gaps between the Allied beachheads in the days to come. Still, the German objective for the night was no longer to repel. It was to survive. The goal of throwing the Allies back into the sea on the first day had already failed. June 6, 1944 ended in a decisive strategic victory for the Allies. The cost was staggering. Over 10,000 Allied casualties, including more than 4,400 confirmed dead. But the mission had succeeded. The beachhead was real, it was stable, and it was growing. That day, more than 155,000 Allied troops, American, British, Canadian, along with thousands of vehicles, tanks, and artillery pieces, had landed safely on the shores of Normandy. The opening phase of Operation Overlord was complete, and a corridor into Europe had been breached. That evening, many soldiers fell asleep right where they had fought. Some slumped over their rifles, others lay atop their backpacks in shallow pits dug hurriedly into the sand. Their eyes stung from gunpowder, their hands still clenched around their weapons. In their hearts was a storm of emotion, the ache of loss, the weight of survival, and the quiet pride of knowing they had done what the world needed them to do. On the distant horizon, flares still pulsed above the surf. But the sky over Normandy was no longer choked with death. The worst of the day's carnage had passed. And yet, the war was far from over. Ahead lay counterattacks, burning hedgerows, shattered villages, and cemeteries not yet dug. But whatever came next, June 6, 1944, D-Day, had already carved its place in history. Not just as a military operation, but as a profound testament to human courage, sacrifice, and the pursuit of freedom. It marked a turning point in World War II, a day when the tide began to turn, and the liberation of Western Europe truly began. In the years that followed, the world would not forget the price paid on those blood-stained sands. The beaches where thousands fell would forever be remembered, not by their code names, but by a title that speaks to what was won there: the beaches of freedom. While thousands of Allied soldiers were storming the beaches of Normandy, forcing open the gates of Europe from the west, another decisive battle had already been fought a year earlier in the east. At Kursk, both Germany and the Soviet Union unleashed the largest concentration of armored forces the world had ever seen. If Normandy was the day of destiny for the West, Kursk was the moment the Red Army proved it had seized the initiative for good. Two battles, fought hundreds of miles apart, yet both delivered the same verdict: The Nazi Reich was on the road to collapse. In the summer of 1943, the Eastern Front was bracing for a decisive confrontation, the Battle of Kursk. After the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad earlier that year, Adolf Hitler was desperate to regain the strategic initiative. He believed that a massive assault on the Kursk salient, a bulge in the Soviet defensive line, could change the course of the war. The plan, codenamed Operation Citadel, was drawn up by the German High Command. The goal was to strike the Kursk bulge from both the north and south, encircling and annihilating Soviet forces concentrated there. If successful, Hitler hoped this would shatter Soviet resistance and force them back onto the defensive once again. The Kursk salient stretched about 550 kilometers across and 150 kilometers deep, between Oryol in the north and Belgorod in the south. Seeing the chance to trap a major Soviet force, Hitler committed nearly all his remaining strength. Around 900,000 troops, 2,700 tanks, 10,000 artillery pieces, and 2,000 aircraft. He concentrated up to 70% of all German tanks and 65% of the Luftwaffe on the Eastern Front for this single battle. New weapons such as the Tiger I, Panther tanks, and Ferdinand, Elephant, tank destroyers were introduced, with hopes of overwhelming the Soviet T-34s. Hitler demanded victory at all costs, declaring that Kursk would be a warning to the entire world of Nazi Germany's might. But the Soviets had already uncovered the plan. After their triumph at Stalingrad, Soviet intelligence, aided by Allied reports, provided Moscow with clear insight into German intentions at Kursk. On July 2, 1943, Joseph Stalin ordered the Red Army to prepare for the coming offensive. Under Marshals Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, the Soviets constructed an unprecedented defensive system in depth. 5 successive defensive lines stretching 250 to 300 kilometers, packed with trenches, anti-tank ditches, minefields, and fortified strongpoints. More than 20,000 guns were positioned, including 6,000 anti-tank cannons and hundreds of Katyusha rocket launchers along the likely German breakthrough routes. In the skies, thousands of Soviet aircraft were deployed, most notably the IL-2 Sturmovik ground attack planes, nicknamed flying tanks, ready to strike at German armor from above. Engineers also planted over 500,000 anti-tank mines and about 440,000 anti-personnel mines across the approaches. Altogether, the Soviets massed over 1.3 million troops, more than 3,400 tanks and self-propelled guns, 19,000 artillery pieces and mortars, and about 2,200 combat aircraft in the region. Their determination was clear. Kursk would be turned into a death trap, grinding down the German forces before unleashing a decisive counteroffensive. After multiple delays while waiting for favorable conditions and the arrival of new weapons, Hitler finally fixed the start date of the Kursk offensive for early July 1943. On the night of July 4th into the early hours of July 5th, the Germans launched Operation Citadel. At first, their infantry units carried out probing assaults along the front line to clear the way for the armored spearheads behind. Around 10:30 p.m. on July 4th, in the southern sector of the Kursk salient, German troops quietly seized several key heights, turning them into artillery observation posts. Yet the Soviets were already on full alert. At about 2 a.m. on July 5th, realizing that the enemy was massing for a general offensive, the Voronezh and Central Fronts unleashed a massive preemptive bombardment. Thousands of guns and Katyusha rocket launchers opened fire at once, pouring a storm of shells onto the German assembly areas. This sudden Soviet strike threw the German attack formations into confusion, delaying the advance of army groups south and center by 2 to 3 hours, easing the pressure on the Soviet defenses. At 4:30 a.m. on July 5th, the Battle of Kursk officially erupted. German artillery roared to life, blasting Soviet positions on both the northern and southern flanks of the salient. Immediately afterward, the armored spearheads of the Wehrmacht surged forward. In the south, hundreds of tanks, including Tigers and Panthers, formed wedge-shaped assault groups and hurled themselves at the Soviet lines. Behind them, mechanized infantry and self-propelled guns followed closely, attempting to break through and split the defense in depth. Brutal tank and infantry battles flared up across a front stretching for dozens of kilometers. On the very first day, the Germans tried 4 times to rupture the Soviet lines, but the layered defenses, reinforced by dense minefields, made progress excruciatingly difficult. German engineers struggled to clear safe passages through the mines under relentless Soviet artillery and mortar fire. Many tanks that did enter the cleared lanes hit hidden mines or were struck by well-placed Soviet anti-tank fire, bursting into flames in the open steppe. Smoke and dust blanketed the battlefield, the earth itself shaking under the thunder of thousands of guns and bombs. In the northern sector, the scene was no less ferocious. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge committed the German Ninth Army under General Walter Model and the 2nd Panzer Army to strike southward, aiming for the towns of Ponyri and Olkovatka along the Oryol-Kursk axis. This was the junction between the Central Front under Rokossovsky and the Voronezh Front under Vatutin. The Germans hoped to punch through here and encircle the Soviet 13th Army, repeating the kind of encirclement victories they had achieved in 1941. But by 1943, the Red Army was a very different force, battle-hardened, disciplined, and thoroughly prepared. The German thrusts quickly ran into fierce counterattacks from Soviet reserves. At Ponyri, soon nicknamed the Little Stalingrad, of the Kursk front, Soviet infantry regiments and tank brigades dug in stubbornly against the German armored spearheads. Many strong points fought to the last man. One striking example was Captain Igasev's anti-tank gun company north of Ponyri, which held out until its final shell, destroying 19 German tanks and armored vehicles before being wiped out. In savage close-quarter fighting inside the town, tanks blasted each other at point-blank range. Some, crippled with broken tracks, continued firing until destroyed. The small town shook under the inferno its ruins, echoing with explosions, gunfire, and screams, while blackened hulks of German and Soviet tanks lay scattered among shattered fortifications. On the southern flank of the Kursk salient, the Germans under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein at first gained faster momentum. Along the Belgorod-Kursk axis, Army Group South, consisting of the 4th Panzer Army under General Hermann Hoth and Army Detachment Kempf, threw its full strength toward the town of Prokhorovka. This was a vital position, about 87 kilometers southeast of Kursk, guarding the gateway into the Soviet rear. For a full week, from July 5th to 11th, the fighting was relentless. Despite pouring in maximum effort, the Germans managed to advance no more than 35 kilometers at the southern spearhead. Tens of thousands of soldiers from both sides fell for every patch of contested ground. The skies became a battlefield as well, with thousands of aircraft locked in duels for air supremacy. In the early days, the Luftwaffe, using Stuka dive bombers and FW-190 fighters, provided close support to German armor, inflicting heavy losses on the Soviets. Only by July 10th to 11th, when the Red Air Force committed reserves and began regaining part of the air advantage, was the German advance effectively slowed. Still, Manstein resolved to deliver one final steel blow, betting on a concentrated thrust at Prokhorovka, where the elite armored forces of both sides were converging. On July 12, 1943, just outside Prokhorovka, the largest tank battle in history erupted. At dawn, the 4th Panzer Army launched its strongest assault force, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, with 3 elite divisions, Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf. This was meant to be the decisive strike to smash the Soviet defenses. At the same time, Marshal Ivan Konev's steppe front rushed in the 5th Guards Tank Army under General Pavel Rotmistrov, designated as the Soviet Mobile Counterstrike Force. At 8:30 a.m., Rotmistrov ordered over 500 tanks, mostly medium T-34s, with some light T-70s to charge into the flank of the advancing German army. Within minutes, around 1,500 tanks from both sides were locked in combat across a battlefield no larger than a few dozen square kilometers. According to Rotmistrov's account, within minutes of advancing and firing, the echelon formations of the 18th and 29th Guards Tank Corps had pierced into the German lines. Taken by surprise, the German Tigers and Panthers lost their long-range advantage and were drawn into chaotic, close-range brawls with swarms of T-34s. The fields erupted in smoke and fire, the ground trembling under the barrage of shells. Tanks clashed in confusion, blasting away at ranges so close that many never had the chance to turn their turrets before being destroyed. The Tiger's 88mm gun could obliterate a T-34 from hundreds of meters away, but in this swirling melee, many Tigers fell prey to the smaller, more agile Soviet tanks striking from the flanks. Some machines, crippled with broken tracks, stood immobile in the fields, yet kept firing until their hulls were hit and burst into towering flames. Amid the chaos of Prokhorovka, acts of heroism emerged. The crew of Captain Alexander Skripkin from the 181st Tank Brigade, 18th Corps, charged straight into the enemy formation, destroying 2 Tiger tanks before their T-34 was struck by heavy German fire and set ablaze. Skripkin, wounded, was pulled from the burning tank by his comrades. As they retreated, a Tiger fired after them. In a desperate moment, 2 Soviet crewmen, Sergeant Nikolaev and Gunner Chernov, climbed back into the flaming T-34 and drove it directly into the side of the pursuing Tiger. A tremendous explosion ripped through both machines, their sacrifice taking the German tank down with them. On the German side, resistance was equally fierce. Tank gunner Wilhelm Roos recalled how a T-34 suddenly burst into their formation. His commander shouted to fire, and the Soviet tank only came to a halt when it was barely 8 meters away, a gaping hole torn into its turret by an armor-piercing shell. Roos admitted that the Soviet armor had completely overwhelmed the exhausted German troops after days of relentless combat. By the end of July 12th, the German thrust at Prokhorovka had been halted. Unable to advance further, they dug in defensively on the ground they had already seized. The battle ended with devastating losses on both sides. Some 300 to 400 German tanks destroyed, while the Soviets lost as many as 500 tanks and self-propelled guns. Yet, strategically, the Soviets had achieved their goal, stopping the most dangerous German offensive spearhead. The road to Kursk was closed to the Wehrmacht forever. In the aftermath of Prokhorovka, the German High Command grew deeply concerned. At the same time as the tank clash, news arrived that the Western Allies had landed in Sicily on July 10th, threatening Germany's southern flank. Faced with this new crisis, Hitler personally ordered the termination of Operation Citadel before it could achieve anything of significance. On July 16, 1943, the surviving German armored forces at Kursk were ordered to withdraw to their original positions. In reality, after more than a week of savage fighting, the German offensive at Kursk had collapsed in failure. The battlefield was littered with tens of thousands of German dead, alongside hundreds of charred tanks, guns, and aircraft. In just the offensive phase from July 5th to 16th, German losses exceeded 50,000 men and between 400 to 700 tanks and self-propelled guns. Kursk marked the last time in World War II that the German army would have the strength to launch a large-scale strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. From that moment on, the initiative permanently belonged to the Red Army. As soon as they realized the enemy was beginning to falter, the Red Army seized the opportunity to counterattack. In fact, starting on July 12, 1943, while many German units had not yet withdrawn, the entire Eastern Front shifted into the phase of strategic counteroffensive. In the north, the Western and Bryansk fronts under Generals Sokolovsky and Popov launched Operation Kutuzov, striking directly at the Oryol salient, the stronghold held by the Germans above Kursk. The German forces at Oryol, already weakened after days of battle, were forced to fall back and defend desperately. On the very first day, the Soviets broke through the outer defenses, opening the way for their main forces to pour in. After nearly 3 weeks of relentless fighting, on August 5, 1943, the Red Army liberated Oryol, wiping out the German salient there and continuing the advance. By mid-August, Soviet spearheads had pushed 150 kilometers deep, reaching the outskirts of Bryansk, destroying or shattering 15 German divisions along the way. Meanwhile, in the south, the Voronezh and Steppe fronts under Generals Nikolai Vatutin and Ivan Konev launched the Belgorod-Kharkov offensive, a direct continuation of the Battle of Kursk, with the goal of liberating eastern Ukraine. From August 3rd to 23rd, 1943, fierce battles raged around Belgorod and Kharkov. The Germans had fortified themselves within a defensive belt nearly 90 kilometers deep, with trenches, bunkers, and strong points prepared long in advance. Yet the overwhelming Soviet assault shattered the German tactical lines on the very first day, forcing them into a fighting retreat. On August 5th, Belgorod was liberated, and by August 23rd, Kharkov, one of the most important industrial centers of Ukraine, had fallen, with the Soviet red flag flying over the devastated city. In just 3 weeks, the Red Army destroyed or broke apart another 15 German divisions at the Kharkov front, drove the enemy 140 kilometers westward, and expanded the offensive front to 300 kilometers. The victory of the Belgorod-Kharkov offensive marked the full conclusion of the Battle of Kursk, which had raged since early July. From that moment onward, the Soviet Union not only crushed the last major German offensive on the Eastern Front, but also decisively seized the initiative, shifting permanently to full-scale counteroffensives, paving the way toward the liberation of its territory and the ultimate defeat of Nazi Germany in the years that followed. The Battle of Kursk in the summer of 1943 entered history as one of the largest, bloodiest, and most decisive clashes of World War II. It was not merely a battle, but a colossal showdown between the two greatest war machines of the era. Nearly 3 million soldiers, over 8,000 tanks, and 5,000 aircraft from both sides were thrown into the inferno record-breaking numbers never before seen in human history. Over more than 7 weeks of combat, the cost was staggering. The Soviet Union suffered about 860,000 casualties, with over 1,500 tanks and thousands of guns and aircraft destroyed or damaged. The Germans, too, were bled dry. Around 500,000 officers and soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. 1,500 tanks, 3,000 artillery pieces, and nearly 3,700 aircraft were lost. 30 German divisions, including 7 elite panzer divisions, were wiped out or crippled beyond combat effectiveness. Kursk, following Stalingrad, delivered a mortal blow to Nazi Germany's expansionist ambitions. After this defeat, Hitler's high command permanently lost the ability to mount large-scale offensives on the Eastern Front. From then on, the Wehrmacht was forced into a defensive posture, reacting passively to the increasingly powerful counterblows of the Red Army. For the Soviet Union, however, Kursk marked a strategic turning point. The Red Army seized the initiative, never relinquished it, and carried it all the way to the raising of the red flag over the Reichstag in Berlin in May 1945. The Battle of Kursk in 1943 with the thunder of thousands of tanks and the blazing fields lit by fire and steel, became an epic of tragedy and heroism, etched into human memory. It closed forever the last German hope of victory in the East, and opened the road toward the ultimate triumph of the nations fighting fascism, a victory bought with blood, with tears, and with the limitless sacrifice of millions. Kursk stands as a historic milestone, the moment when the tide of war turned, carrying the world step by step toward final victory in the most brutal conflict of the 20th century.